The average temperature is 57 degrees, cloudy skies. For your information, I'm Jim LaFrone, the New Talk Radio 1230 FYI News.
A little later this morning, Bo Dietl and a daggone deadbeat, Joey Potts and Pans, with their hideous movie reviews. We'll also talk with Senator Edward Kennedy and one of the president's close advisors and friends, Vernon Jordan, also just ahead. It's time now, however, for our old friend and frequent Imus Morning contributor, formerly of ABC News, now with CNN, Jeff Greenfield. He is a senior political analyst over there. Good morning, Mr. Greenfield.
How you doing?
I'm fine. How are you?
Well, pretty good. You know, people have asked what role this new newsstand show is going to fill, and I can now say we're going to fill the void left by Charles Grodin.
Well, I've never heard Charles. First of all, I'm sorry we're late this morning.
That's,
I apologize. Secondly, I've never heard Charles ever say anything bad about anybody or be happy at someone's misfortune, but he was practically gleeful this morning on the news that Charles Grodin's dreadful program on CNBC had, in fact, been yanked.
Well, I always like to see different and unusual things on television because the medium is much too predictable, and I think Mr. Grodin definitely fell in that category. But enough of that, Charles. Let's talk about us.
One of the things Charles and I were talking about, speaking of Charles McCord, was why no one had come up with the title Newsstand for a news program, and then it's great. It's a great title, and apparently our old friend Rick Kaplan came up with that, and it's going to be on at 10 p.m. Sunday evening on CNN, hosted by you and Willow Bay and Judd.
Yeah, there are three different programs under that name, all based on one of the Time magazines. Ours is CNN and Time, and that's Sunday nights at 10.
Oh, okay.
And then CNN and Fortune will be on Wednesday, and CNN and Entertainment Weekly will be on Thursday. And I have to tell you, I think you know that I've done the show a number of years, and I have tried not to sort of hype and go, oh my God, we've got something coming up. The first story we've got Sunday night is going to make news, real news, because it's about a black ops operation by the U.S. military during the Vietnam War. This stuff comes multiply sourced by people who are involved in the mission, and all I can tell you at this point is both the target of the mission and the means used to try to carry that mission out are really most disturbing.
What kind of an operation?
It was a black operation. I mean, off the books, super secret, deniability if it ever got out, because they were doing things, they were aimed at targets and using methods that even now, 28 years later, it's going to raise a lot of eyebrows about what the military was up to.
Like bumping off political figures and stuff?
I have told you more than I'm supposed to already.
Well, why are you friend on the program? You can't tell us anything.
Well, because when the program comes on, we could, how sometimes you come on and say, I have some really interesting news I can't tell you till tomorrow?
Very good point.
Yeah, so we're actually following the journalistic standards of your show, actually. The entire show is premised around the Imus show.
How'd you all find this out, obviously, without detailing the sources and stuff or identifying them?
How did we find?
It's been
an 8-month-long investigation.
Oh, it has?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, we had two choices. We could read page 6, like sometimes McCord does, or we could actually go out and find this news. But it's a pretty amazing story. But what really you inspired me on is the first essay that I'm doing, which are sort of like the ones I do infrequently for Time. I've done the one thing that people on television normally don't do, which is to go after the audience, which I think is a little different. One thing television news does is we're very proud about going after targets, but we pander like crazy to the audience. We beg them to watch. We tell them how wonderful they are. And I'm doing a kind of, hey, what are you up to, guys, in this little essay? So I'm very happy about the first show.
So we have a story that's likely to make news, which is good.
Yes.
Conversely, we're also attacking the audience.
We're raising questions about just how sincere the audience is when it says it wants better stuff on the air.
Oh, we want to hear more stories about education and fewer stories about Lovick on presidential garments.
You got it.
Yeah, well, good for you. You're absolutely right, by the way.
My point is, if you don't, the old line that if you weren't going to kiss me, why did you make me stand on tiptoes? Please do not tell us that you want hard-hitting, really in-depth journalism, and then tell us that what you really want to do is surf for Baywatch reruns for the next.
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right, and we've subscribed to that philosophy forever, and that's why I think these polls and all of these are bogus, and clearly you've Clearly, you're going to articulate.
Yeah, Bill Schneider, who's the CNN analyst who started out as a political analyst and pollster, says that sometimes people think a poll is an exam and they're supposed to give the right answer. And so when people say, well, these polls show, but you got to say, well, just take a step back from them. So basically, we're bracing the audience.
Is he going to be on your show?
I'm sorry?
Is he going to be on your show?
But probably. But
it's horrible.
Have you considered the irony, though, that when you went on MSNBC and I was at ABC, one of the severely underemployed people over there said to me, well, now you can't go on Imus anymore. And I said, why? He said, well, because he's on MSNBC and we're ABC. I said, so in other words, I shouldn't go on a radio show that reaches 15 million people because he's also reaching, a couple 100,000 people on television. Yeah. And when I moved over to CNN, people say, well, I guess Imus isn't going to have you on anymore. Yeah. I said, why? Because you're on CNN. This is going to violate everything I believe about that man's irascibility and approach. So here we are. Well,
I would be forever loyal to you for reasons we don't need to get into now, but I would just make a difference.
Well, it was the bail money, I know.
It's 21 till the hour. We're talking with Jeff Greenfield, senior political analyst for CNN, who launches a new show Sunday night at 10 o'clock on CNN, hooked up with 3 of Time Magazine's magazines, or 3 of Time Inc.'s magazines. Yeah. Jeff does a show in cooperation with Time Magazine, then there'll be another done with Fortune, and another done with Entertainment Weekly, which is probably a pretty good idea, isn't it?
I think so, and you're right. When you think about the name, Newsstand, and you think, well, it's not a complicated name, but it's one of those things where you look around and say, well, nobody's done it. It's like when Rupert Murdoch formed the News Corporation. You might think that some other media entity years ago would have said, that's a reasonable name for a company. But, people are too clever by half in these names they come up with.
I know you guys have for 8 months been working on this story, tracking down government officials who have clearly been trying to murder other folks, or whatever the story is, we'll find out Sunday.
You're on the right, you get the right rhythm going here, yeah.
But have you been paying attention to what else has been going on?
I have attempted to. I just told you I knew that Grodin was canceled. Okay. The French Open is today. I heard Bud Collins. Sure. We're on top of everything over at CNN.
Do you still have any interest, or did you ever have any interest in the Monica Lewinsky affair?
I had some interest. I still have an interest. But what I find every week more and more either amusing or disheartening is that at some point we're going to find out what happened, and if we can go on the air 18 hours a day guessing, and it doesn't get you any closer to the truth. And the one thing that I remain convinced of is whatever the political benefits, short term, that the White House is gaining by their tactics, in the long run, I think the president is going to look back and regret that he employed this strategy of behaving like a criminal defendant instead of like a political leader.
Well, I believe you're absolutely right. Not many people have made that observation. But it is all going to come crashing down on him.
Well, even if he may well fill out his term, but the whole strategy, there's a very basic point, and I have to give him credit. Larry King had a bunch of people on the other night, and he kept asking the president's defenders. He said, if somebody accused me of doing this, and I was just a victim of this, I don't care what the lawyers would have told me. I'm the political leader of the United States. I would have gone out and said, the heck with you guys. Here's what happened. Here's what didn't happen. You cannot be, if you're the president of the United States, like some, accused criminal defendant or white-collar, polluter, using every tactic that you're legally entitled to say, well, we'll just keep putting this off and use funny language, because the ultimate consequence, whether you survive or whether your temporary approval polls are high, is this is how the president's second term is going to be defined.
Tim Russett, of course, the host of Meet the Press, the Washington Bureau Chief for NBC News, has said all along, and I think he still thinks that at some point the president is going to have to tell everybody what exactly the nature of this relationship was. I don't think so, but then I'm not a journalist.
I'm not sure what at some point means, but I think what he's absolutely right about is to put it the other way. If he doesn't, I was going to say his term will end not with a bang but a whimper, but that is clearly not the right way to put it.
Well, it's good. It works for us.
But yeah, this is how the second term just sort of spins into oblivion. It's just, And I do think there's a great phrase that the British use about somebody being too clever by half. And every time I hear one of these White House people or the former Clinton people going into that kind of evasive, Latinate, lawyer-like language, as you would say, it makes my hair hurt. And I think the long-term damage to how President Clinton wants to see himself and be seen by history it's just incalculable at this point.
When you graduated from Yale all those years ago, how did you get a job writing speeches for Robert Kennedy? How did that happen?
Yeah, and I'm thinking of that a lot now because it's 30 years since he was murdered. I wanted to get into a particular class, and the professor said, you come for one time, but you better be really on the top of your game. So I never had a class like that. I was cooking. As it happened, this teacher was an old friend of Robert Kennedy's legislative assistant. And so when I applied for the job, he quite inaccurately said, oh, this guy is really fine. I never showed up in class again, I think. And it was one of those accidents of fate that they were looking for a guy to work for them for a year, and I thought that would be a pretty neat job. And one of the things about Robert Kennedy is that he was very... he didn't run an office on hierarchies. He didn't care how old or young you were. I was in the office. Everybody else was out of the office. He said, I need a speech. Can you write a speech? I said, oh, sure, I can write a speech. What are you kidding? And then I went home and said, how the hell do you write a speech? But and out of that evolved the job where I kind of was a junior, and I emphasized that, speechwriter. And then because in those days you could move from the Senate to a campaign job without going through, 25 hoops. When he ran for president, I wound up on the campaign plane helping the chief speechwriters write speeches.
Had his brother been murdered by the time you went to work for him?
Oh, yeah, no. I went to work for him only for the last year of his life in '67.
Oh, okay.
And
so how do you know how he had changed? I guess it was almost two different people.
Well, the stories about him in the early days, when he was counsel to the Senate, the committee investigating the unions, he was trying to calculate. He was maybe 31 and rough at the edges and very, very much of a hard-nosed guy. When he was campaign manager for John Kennedy, the stories I heard was that he would, he was very, very tough. And I do think, at the risk of sounding like some, two-bit psychologist, that the murder of John Kennedy plunged him into a whole different kind of experience. This guy had never experienced powerlessness. He'd never experienced what it meant to be the victim of fate. And in the most famous, probably, night of that whole campaign, the night Martin Luther King was killed, when he went before that crowd in a ghetto in Indianapolis and made this off-the-cuff speech quoting Aeschylus. Today there'd be 20 spin doctors, I think, around the Canada saying, okay, you go into a ghetto, they don't know Martin Luther King is a kid. Here's a great line from a Greek poet. It was a much less programmed time, and he was speaking from the heart. He went through a genuine crisis of the spirit. I mean, he was thinking of quitting public life. He didn't know what he wanted to do. He couldn't understand how this could have happened. And over those last couple of years, ironically, because he was always called ruthless, there was about him a vulnerability and almost a gentleness. I mean, I've told the story before that the night King was killed, he came back to the hotel. Adam Walensky and I were working with Ted Sorensen long distance on a speech for the next day, although the speech couldn't come close to what he had said off the cuff. And I was just dead tired. I'd been up for 2 days. And I sort of was half falling asleep, and he sort of threw a blanket over me. And I said, this is, you're supposed to be ruthless. And he just said, don't tell anybody. He was an original.
Well, an interesting, Brian Williams last night had an interesting story. Somebody had gone and interviewed this busboy.
Yes. Yes, who now lives in California.
Yeah, and I was struck how innocent and young he looked there on the floor holding Kennedy's head, and how he looks now and how we all look.
Well, Robert Kennedy was not quite 43 years old when he died, and of course, that's startling to realize that who he was and what he represented at that age. And I don't know whether people ask me all the time, would he have won the nomination? Would he have won the election? I haven't a clue. But I do know the loss of that voice over the last 30 years has
changed a lot, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's been a loss.
Good luck with your show.
I really appreciate it.
You're quite welcome. Jeff Greenfield, senior political analyst for CNN here on the Imus Morning Program. The show is called Newsstand, and it debuts Sunday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time on CNN. It's 12 till the hour.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you.
Yeah.
Ask what you can do for your country. My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man.
New Talk Radio 1230 FYI.
The News Talk Radio 1230 FYI.
Here he is now. Good morning, Mr. Greenfield.
And congratulations to you, Pops.
Thank you very much. And thanks.
I thought I heard you say yesterday that you had Wyatt circumcised so he would look more like you.
Yeah.
Well, that raises an interesting question to begin with, but could I urge you to put limits on that? I do not want you to hit the kid in the face with a waffle iron.
Well, that's very nice.
Look more like you. Don't want to do that.
You know, The Little Prince, thank you for on behalf of Wyatt, for the very charming note you wrote and the books. The Little Prince is my wife's favorite book. In fact, I bought her the French version, first edition copy of it.
I want to warn you about one of those books. Richard Scarry's funniest storybook ever.
We had actually ordered it, but go ahead.
Well, the first story in there is called Absent-Minded Mr. Rabbit, and here's what happens. When you have read the story to your child 600 times, and kids will never let you skip a part, after the first 30, if you try to get the kid to bed by skipping, no, Dad, what about the part today, in my sleep, I can recite every word of that story. So just be careful.
So, the last time we talked to you...
yes.
We were talking about this story that you were very mysterious about, this big deal, this big story you had at your debut edition of Newsstand. What was the story again? Indulge me. Bring me up.
The story was a story that in 1970 on a mission to Laos, nerve gas had been used by American military forces as part of their mission, and the mission was in part to track down and kill American defectors. That's a story that we broadcast and a story we have subsequently retracted and apologized for.
Now, I remember in talking, I was going over my notes when you said at the time that you all had multiple sources.
Well, that's
I don't mean you, but I mean the folks.
No, part of the problem, when people ask how could this have happened, it would have been a lot better if the story had been made up, because then you'd start tracking it down and you'd say, well, there's nothing here, like the Janet Cook story of the 8-year-old kid on heroin in Washington many years ago. This story indeed had a lot of sources. The problem is that when you added it all together, what we didn't have was a story that we should have broadcast. The basic dilemma here, in my view, was that the producers got so convinced that they were right that any people they talked to who said it didn't happen, it couldn't have happened, were kind of minimized, relegated, left out of the piece for whatever reasons. And so, indeed, there were plenty of sources at that level. The problem is when you looked at the whole story in totality, it did not journalistically add up at all. That's why we wound up saying that there was no proof and no credible evidence that this had happened. That the way, for instance, Admiral Moore had been used and what he had said and what he hadn't said and what he had said to wave them off the story and to caution them was kind of put aside once these producers were totally convinced they were onto the story.
Well, they still think they're right.
That's right. And one of the more depressing parts of this, and boy, there's enough depression here to go around, is that they're now claiming that CNN caved in to Henry Kissinger and Colin Powell. That's why the story was retracted. The story was retracted because when questions began being asked, and we asked Floyd Abrams, who was by no means a press bashing, he's a media attorney, to go and really vet this story out and look at all of the interviews and all of the notes. It didn't add up. I mean, the idea that having gone out on a limb on a story, we would hastily retract it out of Pentagon fear. I mean, CNN is, after all, the network. The years before I ever got there, That took incredible heat for broadcasting out of Baghdad during the Gulf War. It was not something that the American military and defense establishment was happy about. So at the same time we're being attacked for being a left-wing news organization that was eager to do a story smearing American military forces, we're also being attacked now for caving into the military. And it's one of those things that is inevitable when you make a mistake as egregious as we made.
Well, I read an article that April Oliver, one of the producers on the story, perhaps the primary producer on the story, wrote in the Washington Post, in which she predicted that the story would be denied and that, in her words, the messenger would be attacked. And so I guess my question is part of that the case? I mean,
this story would have come under intense scrutiny because of what it alleged. Okay.
Yeah.
But my view, and I take no happiness in this. God knows, this is not a wonderful time professionally for me to be part of this. Is that the story failed because it was journalistically unsound. They put together a story, in my view, in which they simply ignored very compelling evidence to check it out more, to hold off. And in my view, they used ambiguous and hypothetical statements that people made to reinforce their own conviction that it happened. I mean, anybody, by the way, if I may, anybody who wants to see what Floyd Abrams concluded, that report is posted in full on the CNN website. You can get it from CNN if you're not a computer type. And it really goes into, I think, very compelling explanation of why this story could not stand journalistically. When people say, well, maybe it'll turn out to be true, that's not relevant. What we had, I mean, when you look at it carefully, should never have been broadcast, and the mistakes were that.
Well, why wasn't somebody asking all these questions ahead of time?
Because there's a phrase that many people in journalism use. I've heard it from Paul Friedman, who is an ABC executive producer, and I will clean it up for broadcast, that goes, assumption is the mother of all screw-ups. It's not precisely how it's said, but that's the point. And I think I know what happened here is that everyone assumed that the story had been vetted out very carefully, and it turned out when you took a step back and looked at it, there was not the mechanism in place on a story of this nature that should have said, okay, we're going to be devil's advocate. We're going to put this story through an intense kind of scrutiny by people off the program, completely independent of the story, to test this out. We now have in place, you might say this is locking the barn door after the horse is gone, but we now have in place a procedure where exactly that will happen. Other networks do. Up till now, the way that CNN had vetted had never resulted in anything remotely like this. But it failed. I mean, I hope you don't hear any defensiveness in this. We screwed up big time.
Then it's I mean, this is a lame observation, but it really does come down to, Charles and I were talking about this morning, the desire for ratings to make some sort of, I mean, it was y'all's debut program.
Well, there's
no desire for some sort of ratings over.
Well, I almost hesitate to make this point because it will not be believed, but I might as well because it happens to be the case. What was said from the very beginning of this newsstand series was said to the press, it was said in-house, look, this is a cable news network. We don't have the mechanisms to get blockbuster ratings for a show. This is going to be a slow build through the summer and into the autumn. Don't expect any kind of movement. So whatever the subconscious motivations may have been, it was certainly not the case that people went out and said, at least to my knowledge, that boy, we gotta have a huge splash. And look, I mean, in retrospect, which is always easier to see, what this story at the least needed was a very careful examination. And I think if someone independent of the show, with the time to have looked at it, had looked at it carefully, at least they would have said, you have to restructure this piece. You've left out too much. You have miscommunicated what a lot of people said. You've left out questionable information, or information that would throw doubt on this. You haven't presented a journalistically fair account. And the reason I think that wasn't done was less the ratings pressure than the freneticism of getting a whole bunch of new shows on the air. And as I say, that is, as my father used to say, an explanation. It's not an excuse.
Of course, that goof Tony Kornheiser in the Washington Post in his Sunday column had a great observation. And that was when the headline is, we killed our own. Man, you got to be sure you're right about that.
Yeah, well, right. Look, I would put it more broadly. When you have a story, somebody said that the rule in a story like this ought to be, what are the consequences if it's true? What are the consequences if the story's not true? And for instance, there was no need to rush into broadcasting. This is a 28-year-old story. The consequences of misreporting a story about so serious a charge is why so many of us feel so awful about what happened. I mean, it's one thing to get a story wrong about, budget policy or the administration's new campaign finance initiative or personnel changes at the White House. That's just embarrassing. But a story like this, one of the things that I've been doing is reading the email that we're getting from veterans and actually trying to answer some of them and not answer in defense of this, just say, we realize this was a very serious journalistic mistake.
But still, I'm listening carefully to you, and I heard what you said. But still, should perhaps CNN have hung with these producers a little longer? I mean, I'm reminded by the executive producer of our hideous program on MSNBC, Terry Irving,
former colleague of mine,
of how CBS hung with the folks, Mike Wallace and all those folks over the Westmoreland story. In fact, went to court.
Well, but with all due respect to Terry Irving, who I've known for years and hope you stop drinking. That's a lame attempt at humor. He's a good guy. The difference is that the CBS story came under attack for the way that the information was presented. That is, did CBS use unfair editing techniques? Did it match the wrong questions with answers? But I believe had CBS come to the conclusion when that story broke that there was nothing to the story, it was about the uncounted enemy, that Westmoreland and the military had underestimated enemy forces in an effort to persuade Americans that the war was being run. That was a question of interpretation. It was not a question of whether or not the story was fundamentally false. And there's no point. Look, the one thing out of all this that I think, although I know I'll get an argument from some people, that CNN did that I thought was right was once we came to the conclusion that the story could not be supported, it was just straight out there. I mean, we did it on Newsstand. We had Bruce Morton do a story. We put that report on the web. We are trying to say to people, here's exactly how we think we screwed up. To stay with a story once you believe it is false, or at least unsupportable, is not, to me, a really good idea.
Well, do you believe it's unsupportable or false?
I think it is at least unsupportable. I simply don't know. I mean, I haven't, I didn't go back into the records. The problem is that when you say it hasn't been disproven, well, neither has Oliver Stone's theory about the Kennedy assassination. The question is, do you have any reason to believe it's true? I know what April Oliver and Jack Smith think. They think they have interviews with people who were there that they believe supports the story. I think there is no credible evidence. And one thing that I think you have to know is that once this controversy erupted, it wasn't as though the folks at CNN didn't try to get more supporting information. I mean, this is not something that any news organization wants to do, to say that a big story that it reported should not have been broadcast. And so, could the story someday turn out to be true? Well, perhaps. But all I'm saying is we did not have it. We did not have the kind of stuff that should have gone on the air.
In your experience, is the level of participation in a story like this that Peter Arnett is suggesting he had the norm for an on-camera reporter?
I can only speak to what I know, what I have done, and what some of my colleagues have done. It is certainly true that in magazine shows where reporters are working, correspondents, they have 5 producers working on stories. There are times when people are brought in and do minimal work. But the fact is that any correspondent, my feeling is, I'll tell you what I think is, if I'm reporting a story, I'm responsible for the story. It's your face, it's your voice. And just as a matter of course, I mean, most people that I know, even when they don't do all the interviews, read all the transcripts and are absolutely part of that process.
I've had the unfortunate experience of being sued on this program for stuff Bernard says. So I've had to take money out of my own pocket. So I'm just...
Really?
I mean, I'm not going to ask you to pass judgment on what you thought Mr. Arnett should have done. But
I can't. What I'm saying to you is that in the universe that I live in, a correspondent who reports a story is responsible for that story as much as anybody else.
The damage that's been done to CNN has in your mind enough been done to fix that, or what needs to be done?
Well, we've taken a hit. Now, if we take a step back and look at every other, news operation, from time to time, there hasn't been any one I know of that hasn't taken a hit of one kind or another, having to pay libel damages, having to apologize for stories, having to explain that a story they put on the air was misreported. This is our turn. There are two things we have to do. One is to put the mechanisms in place that should have been there to begin with to make sure this doesn't happen again, and that's underway. And then what we have to do, it sounds so simple, but it's what anybody has to do in a situation like this, is to get up off the canvas and say, we're going back out and we're going to report and we're going to not make this kind of mistake again. And, you need to measure this story against everything else that this organization has done. And at some point, I was just noticing Newsweek had a poll this week about what people regard as the most credible source of information. I believe this poll was taken after this story was retracted. CNN is still tops, and I think that speaks to the kind of inherent fairness of the public in saying this was a serious mistake, but it does not wipe out everything else that you've done.
Well, there were some people at Time Magazine who obviously had a question about this story, and I guess Walter Isaacson made the decision to put the question mark on to pose the nerve gas allegation as a question, and that should have raised some eyebrows, shouldn't it?
There were lots of eyebrows raised, and part of what happened, to go back to what Terry Irving was asking you to ask me, is, when your producers have worked on a story for 8 months, and you say, well, what are your sources? And they produce a 150-page briefing book of sources and what people said. Your instinct is to say, well, I'm going with this team. This is not made up here. They're citing high-ranking sources, and that's the dilemma that I think everybody got caught in. They wanted to support the work of the producers, and it was only after the story broke that the doubts mushroomed into very, very serious doubts. But look, I hope you hear what I'm saying. This was a screw-up of substantial proportions, and the price we're paying in terms of the fact that we've had to apologize for the story, that the people who ideologically have seen CNN for years as a ideologically suspect news organization because of Ted Turner or Jane Fonda or whatever, are going to. This is ammunition for them, and we see this now literally in the last few days among the more conservative folks. They say, well, look at CNN. You know why they did this story. They were out to destroy the reputation of the American military.
I think Ted's got to pull himself together based on a statement he made the other day. He said, well, he's got to get a grip here. Get some of Mike Wallace's medication or something. I don't know.
Well, in fact, my memory is that Mike Wallace did, in fact, suffer, he's talked about this, some pretty serious emotional consequences from being in that courtroom in New York day after day.
Oh, he was walking into the surf with William Styron and old Art Buchwald. Yeah, he was a mess.
But look at him now. And I think look at what happened with Dateline after that truck story, where it turned out that they had helped the truck explode. Everybody has. I don't mean to say everybody, but there are very few news organizations that haven't suffered serious damage in terms of misreported stories. This is ours, and God willing, it's the last one for if these mechanisms work the way they're supposed to, and I hope they should. And people look, someone like myself who may have been only, let me try to say this carefully, peripherally involved in this story, I feel personally responsible for not looking at this story in the midst of trying to put a new show on and everything that entails, and saying, wait a second, in between our worry about the 50 other things, how solid is this story? But when I'm thinking of this, whenever we used to get lost when I was a kid on Sunday drives, my mother used to try to cheer us up by saying, well, it's an adventure. which is probably explains my lack of enthusiasm for adventures. The only mildly saving grace is it is a profoundly humbling experience, particularly if you spend a lot of years as a media critic, explaining how other people did things wrong, to find yourself in the middle of a story that just blows up in your face. And you go back and you try to relive it, and you say, how could we have been so wrong about this? How could we have been so indifferent? And you look at it and you understand how. It doesn't make it any easier to live with. What it does make you determined to do is to say, all right, well, having gone through this, we now know what we should have known much earlier, and we're not going to let it happen again. And we're going to apologize, as we have apologized to the viewers of CNN, and particularly to the people on that mission, and say we should not have broadcast that story.
Is anybody at CNN still looking into this?
Well, I think it was looked into in some detail. I mean, I don't know what else is to be looked into. If you mean, are they still pursuing this?
Well, I mean, I wonder if Jack and April are still.
I believe they want to go and continue reporting the story. They are. I think that's part of the problem. They are absolutely convinced. And I have to say, some of the language that they've used, lynch mob, caved into corporate pressure, Colin Powell and Henry Kissinger forced CNN to retract. I got to be honest with you. In my view, that casts even more doubt on the veracity of the story. I mean, that's like being indicted for something and then charging anti-Semitism or racism. I mean, the issue is was this story journalistically supportable? Should it have gone on the air? And I think the idea that that this was some kind of we really believe in the story, but we have to cave so that in the next war we'll be able to cover it with the Pentagon's approval. No.
Well, I greatly appreciate you coming on and talking about it.
Well, I went on your air and touted the story, and one of the things I've always argued as a sometime media critic is, we have to hold us, we ought to behave by the same standards we ask other people to. And if, when politicians make mistakes, we want them to come on and fess up and not use that kind of passive Latinate mistakes were made, this is regrettable. But just step up and say, I screwed up. I don't see how I could not do that here.
Are you going on vacation now in case somebody wants to break into your apartment? Or?
Yes, I am. I'm going far, far away with the woman in And yes, I am. I'm going away, and I'm not seeking asylum. I will be back. But thanks for raising the issue of an unoccupied apartment. I really. By the way, perhaps I should give out your address so that other people can drop off things at your apartment. Would you like that, Don?
I don't think I would.
Shall I do that?
Have fun, Jeff. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Jeff Greenfield, CNN, here in the Imus Morning Program. It's 17 till the hour.
Now you're feeling low and a fish roll by. You need a little Imus in the morning.
The average temperature